Good evening, everyone. We're happy to be here. I know it's been a while since we've studied the book of Daniel, but we're finally back on track. And if you remember from last time, we were studying the first part of chapter 7. And one of the points that we ended on was that when we were looking at that very last beast that was shown to Daniel in vision, the way that the Bible describes this beast is as something that we have never seen. And when we look at the history of the Roman government and the Roman kingdom during that time, it's very clear to see that the type of government that the Roman was very different than what the world had ever seen. And so today we're going to continue with Daniel chapter 7. And so we're going to pick up right around verse 25. And the part that says, he shall think to change times and laws. And so this beast, one of the characteristics of this beast was that this beast was going to attempt to change the times and laws. When we look at the Bible from Genesis all the way to Revelation, one of the things that becomes very apparent, it is that in the Ten Commandments, there's only one commandment that has to do with time. And who can tell me what commandment that is? There's only one that has to do with time. So what is a single commandment that has to do with time? That is correct. It is the fourth commandment. That is the only commandment in the Bible that talks about time. And so the question that we're going to answer today is, how does the Roman government and this entity fit into Daniel chapter 7 and 25, and how did this change actually happen? And so we're going to go back in history, and so right around the 4th century, this is where persecution begins to happen. And again, as we read in our introductory text in Daniel chapter 25, there's a couple of things that this beast was going to try and accomplish. And so the first one was that he shall speak pompous words against the Most High. And then the other characteristic of this beast was that it was going to persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times, and not only times, but law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, and times, and half a time. And so the question that we want to answer is, well, who is this little horn that thinks that he can change God's law? And so we realize in history that this fourth beast is actually Rome. It also will, as we will see later on, it persecutes the saints, and it also speaks blasphemous things, and it also tries to alter God's law. And so when we go back to Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, this is the first instance in the Bible where we see that God institutes the Sabbath. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 through 3, it says, and on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. And so right from the beginning, God institutes the Sabbath, and consider the Sabbath as the very last thing that God creates. He creates Adam and Eve, and the very next thing is the Sabbath. However, as we will see throughout a couple of historical facts that we're going to look at this evening, we all tend to forget the Sabbath. And in Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11, God gave the commandments once again to the people of Israel, and he starts off by saying, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So one of the things that becomes very apparent is that the Jewish people, of all people, they were the ones that were very acquainted with the Sabbath. The Sabbath was given to Adam and Eve, and yet here you have God communicating to his people once again, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. And even throughout the Old Testament, we also have in Isaiah 58, verses 13 through 14, it says, if thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words. And then he adds, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. And so throughout the Old Testament, God continues to communicate to his people to remember the Sabbath. And so now the question is, how did this change actually come to pass? How was it possible for God's people at some point in history to forget about the Sabbath? So, how did this happen? When we go to history, right around the first century, we're going to begin to realize how is it that God's people begin to forget about the Sabbath little by little. It wasn't a big change, and one of the things that becomes very apparent is that never in the history of the church was there ever a time where the church got together and decided to vote on changing the observance of the Sabbath to Sunday. And so we're going to see how that change was very, very gradual. And so right around the first century, we see that the early church was largely Jewish. So all of them were keeping the Sabbaths. And so we have references like in Acts 13:42 through 44. And one of the things that I would like to share with you is that there's a church that was actually found, that it's a very, very old church. And we're going to take a look at this church right now. How many of you have heard about the Church of Dura Europos? That was one of the oldest church, the earliest Christian church that archaeologists has been able to find. And according to them, this is one of the churches where you don't see any signs of the Sabbath ever been changed. Everything that they found there was very consistent with a Christian church that observed the Sabbath. And this was right around 200 AD. The way that this church was structured was very interesting. Churches at that time weren't as what we know today. And according to archaeologists, this church was very similar to a home, to a very large home during that period of time. And so if you can see here, right as you were entering the house, this was the first home church that was discovered. And so as you're going in, you have the courtyard right around there. To your right, you're going to see the place where they would assemble in order to, let's say, hear a message. But there was a very specific area on the back once you cross the courtyard, and this area was dedicated to teaching. Many believe that it is very equivalent to what we know today as a Sabbath school. So this is where teaching actually happened. And to your left side, this is where they had the baptistry, where baptisms would often take place. The reason why baptisms and during that period were done inside it's very clear. The church was suffering persecution, and so when people wanted to get baptized, the best way to do it was to do it inside, and so not in public. And so how did things begin to change? So this is one of the first instances where we have a Christian church where no mention of Sunday is actually mentioned. Now, right around 306 and 337, around Constantine's time, he begins to make this change. And the reference here is from Codex Justinianus. It says, on the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed. And so this is the first instance where there's actually a law that is made in order for people to worship on Sunday. But the question that we want to ask is, how did we get there? How do we get to the point where Constantine decides to make this change? Was that something that he thought, all of a sudden and decided that this was a change that he was going to do? So let's take a look at what were some of the religions within the Roman government. All right, and so remember, the Roman government they conquered a lot of kingdoms, and so as a result, what happens when a government goes and invades other kingdoms? what usually happens? We actually see this very well in Europe. Actually, last week I was reading an article. I found it very interesting, and it was more like a meme. It was more like a parody, and they were comparing and realizing that the British actually went and got involved with India, and as a result, now in the UK you have a lot of high officials within the British government that are actually Indian or Muslim, and so they were noting that when a government goes and invades another country, at some point, in the future, you're going to have some of the people that you conquered in your government. And so the very same way with the Roman government, that's exactly what happened. They conquered a lot of kingdoms, and as a result, they had a mix of different religions within their kingdom. The first one was there were a group of people that were mostly Latin, and they worshipped Jupiter. So that was one religion. The other religion was obviously the Roman military god, which was Mars. And also, you had Egyptians, and Egyptians worshipped the god Isis. You also had the Persians, some of the residue from the previous kingdoms, and so the Persians worshipped Mithras. And then you also had the people from Alexandria, and they worshipped the god Serapis. And so you had a mix of different religions within the Roman government. But one of the things that is very interesting is that there was only one thing that actually unified the Roman government. And what do you think that actually was? You had several religions, different points of view, but there was one thing that every religion could actually agree on. What do you think it was? Everybody had something in common, and that is they all loved the sun god. And so all of them could agree on one thing. And so from a government standpoint, if you want to unite the Roman government, what do? You find a common ground, and that common ground was the worship of the sun. And so eventually, Constantine realizes that the best way to unify his government is to let's all agree on one thing and let's worship on Sunday. But there was a group of people that did not do that. And obviously that was the Christians. And so that's where problems actually began. And so what I want us to look at now, like it says here, everyone from soldiers to emperors, pagans to philosophers, recognized the sun as a visible symbol of power, life, cosmic order, and also imperial authority. And so, from their perspective, sun is everything. Sun, allowed them to plant their crops. The sun was very useful, and so obviously they thought that sun was the way to go and the way to worship. And so what begins to happen right after that? In the next slides, we're going to see how this change actually came to pass. So Justin Martyr, he wrote in 150 AD, and it says, on the day called Sunday, all who live in the cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read. He also added, Sunday is a day on which we all hold our common assembly, because it is the first day on which God, having wrought a change in darkness and matter, made the world, in Jesus Christ our Savior, on the same day rose from the dead. And then he adds, for he was crucified on the day before that of Saturn, or Saturday, and on the day after that of Saturn, which is the day of the sun. Having appeared to his apostles and disciples, he taught them these things. Notice that the way that he's proposing this change was very subtle. He's saying, this is the day that Jesus actually rose. But notice that nowhere in this, what they call the first apology, nowhere do we have a verse that actually states this is why we need to worship on Sunday. And so in the next few quotes, I want you to notice the time. And so the next few quotes are actually in chronological order. And what I want all of us to notice is how the pressure begins. Oftentimes we know that change is very hard, and I believe that most of us we really don't enjoy change when it's sudden. But we're going to notice here that when Sabbath was changed to Sunday, the changes were very, very subtle. And so the next quotes are going to be in chronological order, so pay attention to that. And you're going to see how the pressure begins to increase. So this is the first one. This was around AD, around 250 and 350. And so this is what they wrote. Do not keep the Sabbath with the Jews, but let every one of you keep the Lord's Day as a festival. So they started off very simple. As we know, the church was getting pressured by the government to go ahead and adopt the day of worship that everybody was worshiping, including all of those other religions that were in the Roman government. And so the church, felt the pressure, and so they decided, let's try and be a little bit more accommodating. And so they start by saying, do not keep the Sabbath with the Jews. Obviously, the Jews had a very negative connotation. And so they decided, we don't want to be associated with the Jews. And the best way not to be associated with the Jews is don't keep the Sabbath. So they said, do not keep the Sabbath with the Jews, but let every one of you keep the Lord's Day as a festival. Notice here, they're not saying keep the Lord's Day, as a day of worship. They just said, let's keep the Lord's Day as a festival. And so for a Christian that wasn't reading their Bible quite as much, if we're going to keep the Lord's Day as a festival, why not? Then it continues. Around that same year, they also wrote, you shall not keep the Sabbath as the Jews do, but you should keep the Lord's Day. So things begin to change just a little bit. The first one is keep the Lord's Day as a festival. The next one is let's keep the Lord's Day. Right around AD 363, all the way through 364, we have another writing from the Canon 29. And it says, Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day. So things begin to change, and now all of a sudden they're saying, don't become like a Jew by resting on the Sabbath. You must work on this day, right? But the Lord's Day they shall specially honor. So things begin to change. Now they're saying, don't be like the Jews. Same arguments that they had right from the beginning. But now they were saying, you must work on that day. So now you must work on the Sabbath day. And you must now honor what day? The Lord's Day. And so the Lord's Day for them was Sunday. So that was around 363 all the way to 364. Things begin to get a little bit more pressure. And so right around AD 538, at the Council of Orleans, Canon 28, they wrote the following. It is a Jewish superstition to refrain from work on the Sabbath. Christians shall not be idle on the Sabbath. So now they're using a little bit different of a tactic. Now they're saying if you rest on the Sabbath, that means that you're lazy. So you don't want to be called lazy, work on the Sabbath. So this was 538. Now things begin to actually change drastically, and this is in AD 692. Now things begin to get a little bit crazy here. This is from Canon 65, from the Quintisext Council. It is also called the Council in Trullo. And they wrote, if any Christian shall fast or celebrate with the Jews, and so the reference was they were talking about the Sabbath, he shall be what? Deposed, or in other words, you're going to be removed from the church, and what else? Or excommunicated. And so for them, excommunication was a huge deal. Because remember, back in the day, communities were a little bit more, connected than we are today. And so you depended on other people for survival. And so if you were excommunicated, that meant that none of the church members could actually do business with you. If you had a farm, if you produced any types of goods, the church was not going to trade with you. And so you were pretty much banned socially. And also, not only socially, but you were also banned commercially. You couldn't trade. And so, although they already had currency during that time, most of their trade was still, most of their economy was based on trade. If I plant corn, then I can trade with other, especially church members, and make a living. And so right around AD 692, this is where things actually begin to get very difficult for the Christian community that actually wanted to keep the Sabbath. And so now it wasn't, let's go ahead and have a festival and celebrate the Lord's Day. It was like you either keep the Sabbath, you either keep Sunday and work on the Sabbath to avoid being called lazy, or else you're going to be deposed or you're going to be excommunicated. And again, going back to Constantine's declaration, on the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in the cities rest, and let all workshops be closed. If you continue to read on this codex, he actually added a little clause to make an exception for the farmers. So if you were a farmer, you were actually in luck, because he believed that you should actually continue, because otherwise, there was not going to be any food. And so he made provision for the farmers. But everybody else, if they had a shop, they had to close. And so the Council of Laodicea in 364, Canon 29, it says, Christians shall not Judaize and be idle on the Saturday. We also read that one already. But shall work on that day. So he was telling them that they had to work. But the Lord's day they shall especially honor. And as being Christians, shall, if possible, do no work on that day. If, however, they are found Judaizing, they shall be shut out from Christ. So very, very strong words. They were letting them know that if they actually worked on Sunday, they could actually be shut out from Christ. Actually, let me correct that. They would be shut out from Christ if they were found what? Keeping the Sabbath. Obviously, they were okay if they worked on Sunday. Notice it says shall if possible. So they weren't very strict on that you had to rest on Sunday, but they were saying if it's possible, don't work on Sundays. And so things continue to change. And now I want us to read, this one is strict directly from the Catechism. And as you know, the Catholic Church actually had this merge with the Roman government, which produced the religion that we know today as Catholicism. And one of the things that I appreciate from the Catholic Church is that they're very open when it comes to why this change actually happened. They're very transparent. And so this is what they say. What is the Sabbath day? And in response, it says Saturday is a Sabbath day. And then question, why do we observe Sunday instead of Saturday? Very valid question. And the answer is, we observe Sunday instead of Saturday because the Catholic Church and the Council of Laodicea transferred the solemnity from the Saturday to Sunday. So pretty straightforward. They let us know why that change actually happened. And so history confirms it. This is exactly how it happened in the Council of Laodicea. Also from the Catholic Encyclopedia, this one is from 1913. It says the Church, after changing the day of rest from the Jewish Sabbath, or the seventh day of the week to the first, made the third commandment refer to Sunday as the day to be kept holy as the Lord's day. So when we go back to Daniel chapter 7:25, it becomes abundantly clear that the beast that is found, the little horn that is found in Daniel 7, is actually referring to this power, to the Catholic Church, to the Roman Catholic Church, because they make it abundantly clear that who is the one that is attempting to change the law of God. They're very clear. It says the Church, after changing the day of rest from the Jewish Sabbath or the seventh day of the week to the first, made the third commandment refer to Sunday. And when we look to history, you will not find, there is no other entity, no other government, nor any other religion that has attempted to change the law of God, and in this case, the fourth commandment. There's only one, and so it's actually very clear. So now let's go to Martin Luther. From his works, volume 22, this is what he says about the Sabbath. He says, they allege the Sabbath changed into Sunday, the Lord's Day contrary to the Decalogue, or in other words, the Ten Commandments, as it appears, neither is there any example more boasted of than the changing of the Sabbath day. Great, say they, is the power of the church, since it has dispensed with one of the 10 commandments. And so Martin Luther actually noted that, and when we read some of his writings, he's very indignant when he refers to what the Catholic Church tried to do. This one is from Neander in church history. It says the festival of Sunday. Again, you see that the language is very similar. The festival of Sunday, like all other festivals, was always only a human ordinance, and it was far from the intentions of the apostles to establish a divine command in this respect. And also from Jeremy Taylor, this one is from the 1600s. It says, the Lord's day did not succeed in the place of the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was wholly abrogated, and the Lord's day was merely of ecclesiastical institution. And so they also recognized that this change was not a biblical change. This was just a change that the church decided to establish. Now, the next quote that we're going to read is from a little bit closer to our time, and he was a Baptist historian. Very, very studious guy, and he lived around 1893, and this is what, and his name was Edward Hiscox, and this is what he wrote in regards to the Sabbath. And so he says, and in this case, he's addressing all the Baptist ministers in New York in 1893, and he said, there was and is a commandment to keep the holy the Sabbath day, but that Sabbath day was not Sunday. So you can imagine, as a Baptist minister, you're coming in front of a lot of ministers, theologians, and he starts off by saying, there's one day that has not been kept, and that is the Sabbath day. And then he says, it will be said, however, with some show of triumph, that the Sabbath was transferred from the seventh to the first day of the week. Where can the record of such transaction be found? Not in the New Testament, absolutely not. Later on, he goes on to also write in that same address to the Baptist ministers, if you go to the very last part, it says, but what a pity that it comes branded with a mark of paganism and christened with the name of the sun god, when adopted and sanctioned by the papal apostasy and bequeathed as a sacred legacy to Protestantism. And so as he's addressing the Baptist ministers and pastors, he's very indignant and realizes that this change has been done by the church, and interestingly enough, it has been heritage that they have gotten from the Catholic Church, and so obviously he was very upset at that. So that was Edward Hiscox, 1893. But the Bible in Revelation 14:12 tells us that the people of God are going to be very peculiar. And in Revelation 14:12, it tells us that God's people are going to have one characteristic. And it says, here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. And so if we want to be a part of the people of God, one way to identify who the people of God actually is quite simple. They have the faith of Jesus, and they keep part of the commandments, 90% of the commandments. It says here, and they keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. So it is my prayer that as we went through this history, that we remember that when this change actually happened, it wasn't something that happened, one day to another. It was a series of compromises that took place. Everything began by making little changes, something that you could accept, all the way till finally the church was actually banning people that were keeping Sabbath. So may the Lord help us, and when we look at our Christian life, that we realize that we have to live by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And let us also remember to keep studying the Word of God. Amen.